Carl Jung discovered something few spiritual teachers dare to admit. Awakening doesn't energize you, it empties you. After studying hundreds of people who experienced profound spiritual breakthroughs, Jung noticed a disturbing pattern. Within months, nearly all of them lost motivation, not because they failed on the path, but because they succeeded too well. They saw through the illusion of life so clearly that meaning itself dissolved. Jung called this the awakening paradox, the moment when enlightenment becomes emptiness, when clarity becomes confusion, when spiritual success becomes psychological crisis. You thought awakening would fill you with fire and purpose. Instead, it extinguished every flame that once drove you. So now you lie awake at night wondering, why doesn't anything matter anymore? Why do your old goals feel hollow, like props from a stage play you've outgrown? Why do you understand more than ever, yet care less about everything? Here's the truth Jung uncovered. This emptiness isn't a failure. It's the next stage, and there is a specific psychological process for transforming that void into the deepest, most authentic motivation you will ever experience. Because everything you've been told about awakening is wrong. You were promised bliss, you were promised clarity, you were promised divine purpose. But Jung found the opposite. The more you awaken, the more you realize. Every goal you chased was a mask. Every motivation was fueled by fear, ego, or conditioning. Every dream was inherited, not born. And so the spiritual path leads you straight into what Jung called the Nigredo, the blackening, the death of the old self. A place where you are too conscious to go back to sleep, but not yet reborn into who you truly are. Most people mistake this for depression. They panic. They try to resurrect their old ambition. But Jung warned, trying to return to old motivations after awakening is like trying to force a butterfly back into a cocoon. It isn't just impossible, it is a betrayal of your evolution. The real danger isn't the emptiness itself, it's this. You will either force yourself back into ego-driven goals or become trapped in spiritual limbo forever. Neither path leads to authenticity. But Jung discovered a third path, to consciously enter the void and allow a new form of purpose to be born from it. He learned this from a patient who changed everything. Her name was Maria. She came to Jung after what she described as the most profound spiritual experience of her life, a complete dissolution of self into pure consciousness. For weeks she felt euphoric, free, untouchable. Then it happened. She stopped caring about work, about love, about living, not out of sadness, but out of cosmic indifference. "I've seen the truth," she told Jung. "Nothing matters. Goals are illusions. Achievement is ego. Love is attachment. Work is distraction. I can't pretend anymore." Most spiritual teachers would have called this failure. Jung didn't. He recognized the Nigredo, the dark night that precedes rebirth, the death of who you thought you were, the desert before the garden. And if you understand it, if you allow it, something new awakens inside you. Not the ego's motivation, but the soul's, and that changes everything. Jung had studied alchemy extensively, understanding it not as primitive chemistry, but as a symbolic map of psychological transformation. The Nigredo is the first stage where the prima materia, your old identity, must be completely dissolved before something new can emerge. But here's what Jung discovered that shocked even him. In our modern world, people can trigger the Nigredo through spiritual practices without understanding what they're entering. They awaken to the emptiness of ego-driven life, but have no framework for what comes next. Jung called this premature enlightenment, accessing higher states of consciousness before developing the psychological container to integrate them. It's like performing surgery on yourself without understanding anatomy. Maria had successfully seen through the illusions that motivate most people, but she had no idea how to function in the world with this knowledge. She was psychologically homeless, too conscious to live unconsciously, but not yet integrated enough to live consciously. Jung spent months with Maria, not trying to restore her old motivations, but helping her understand that her emptiness was actually sacred. She was in the chrysalis phase of human development, the space between caterpillar and butterfly, where everything looks like formless goo. Through their work together, Jung developed what he called the individuation framework, a specific process for navigating the psychological death that spiritual awakening triggers. He realized that the Nigredo wasn't a problem to be solved, but a threshold to be crossed consciously. This discovery revolutionized Jung's understanding of both psychology and spirituality. He realized that most people who seek awakening have no idea they're volunteering for psychological death and rebirth. They think they're signing up for permanent bliss, not temporary annihilation. But Jung found something remarkable. Those who learned to navigate the Nigredo consciously emerged with a form of motivation so authentic and powerful that it could move mountains. They found purpose that couldn't be shaken by external circumstances because it emerged from the depths of their own being. After working with hundreds of patients experiencing post-awakening emptiness, Carl Jung made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about human motivation. The very process that kills your ego-driven desires is the same process that births soul-driven purpose. Jung called this the Individuation Paradox. You must lose yourself completely before you can find yourself authentically. But here's where most people get stuck. They think losing motivation means they're doing something wrong, when actually it means they're doing something right. Jung discovered that all human motivation falls into two categories: persona-driven and self-driven. Person-driven motivation comes from your false self, the mask you wear to get approval, avoid rejection, and maintain social identity. This includes career ambitions, relationship goals, achievement desires, and status pursuits. Self-driven motivation comes from your authentic core, the part of you that exists beyond social conditioning and ego needs. This motivation doesn't seek external validation because it emerges from internal alignment. Here's the paradox Jung uncovered. Spiritual awakening destroys persona-driven motivation before self-driven motivation emerges. You're left in a gap where the old fuel is gone, but the new fuel hasn't appeared yet. Jung found that this gap could last anywhere from months to years, depending on how deeply you understand the process and how consciously you navigate it. Most people panic during this phase and try to artificially restart their old motivations, which Jung warned was like trying to reanimate a corpse. But Jung discovered something remarkable about patients who learned to wait consciously in the void. They began to notice subtle impulses that felt completely different from their old motivations. These weren't driven by fear, need, or external pressure. They emerged from what Jung called soul calling, authentic impulses from the deepest part of their being. Sarah, one of Jung's patients, described it perfectly. I used to be motivated by anxiety, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. When that motivation died after my awakening, I thought I was broken, but slowly I started noticing different impulses. I wanted to create, not to impress anyone, but because creation felt like breathing. I wanted to help people, not to be seen as good, but because their suffering moved something deep in me. Jung realized that self-driven motivation doesn't feel like traditional motivation at all. It doesn't push or drive or demand. It calls, whispers, invites. It feels less like I have to and more like I get to. It's sustainable because it comes from abundance, not scarcity. But here's what Jung found most fascinating. You can't force this new motivation to appear. You can't think your way to authentic purpose. You can only create the psychological conditions for it to emerge naturally. Jung identified 3 specific stages in this transformation: the dissolution where old motivations die, the coagulation where new motivations form, and the integration where soul-driven purpose becomes your primary operating system. The problem is, that most spiritual teachings skip over the psychological specifics of this process. They tell you to follow your bliss without explaining that first, you have to consciously compost your old sense of purpose and wait in the fertilizer of uncertainty. Jung spent years developing specific techniques for navigating each stage consciously, transforming spiritual awakening from a psychological crisis into a guided rebirth. Now I'm going to reveal Carl Jung's most powerful insight about post-awakening emptiness. The realization that completely transformed how he understood human purpose and why most people never discover their authentic calling. Jung discovered that what most people call purpose is actually sophisticated ego defense. Your career goals, relationship aspirations, achievement desires. Jung found that 90% of what drives human behavior is unconscious attempts to avoid feeling inadequate, unloved, or insignificant. During his research, Jung documented a disturbing pattern. People would spend decades pursuing goals that they thought were meaningful only to achieve them and feel completely empty. This wasn't failure. It was the inevitable result of chasing purposes that never belonged to them in the first place. Jung called this purpose poisoning. When you mistake ego-driven desires for soul-driven calling, you think you want success, recognition, or achievement, but what you actually want is to feel worthy, safe, or loved. The problem is that external accomplishments can never fill internal voids. This is why spiritual awakening kills motivation so effectively. When you see through the illusion of the separate self, you also see through the illusion that external achievements can create internal fulfillment. Every goal you've been chasing suddenly looks like a sophisticated form of self-deception. Jung worked with a patient named Thomas who perfectly illustrated this dynamic. Thomas had spent 15 years building a successful business, thinking he was motivated by entrepreneurial passion. But after a profound awakening experience, Thomas couldn't summon any interest in his company. "I built this business because I was terrified of being seen as a failure." Thomas told Jung, "Every late night, every sacrifice, every strategic decision was driven by the fear that I wasn't enough. Now that I can see this clearly, the whole enterprise feels like an elaborate house of cards built on quicksand." Jung helped Thomas understand that his loss of motivation wasn't a spiritual crisis. It was a spiritual liberation. Thomas was finally free from the unconscious fears that had been puppeteering his life decisions. But Jung discovered something crucial. You can't just strip away false purposes without replacing them with authentic ones. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the psyche abhors meaninglessness. If you don't consciously cultivate authentic purpose, you'll either relapse into ego-driven goals or remain paralyzed in purposelessness. Jung developed what he called the purpose archaeology process, a systematic method for excavating authentic calling from beneath layers of social conditioning and ego programming. The process begins with what Jung called desire discrimination, learning to distinguish between ego desires motivated by fear, lack, or social pressure, and soul desires motivated by love, abundance, or authentic expression. Ego desires always contain hidden because clauses. I want to be successful because then people will respect me. I want to find love because I can't bear being alone. I want to make money because I'm afraid of being poor. Soul desires stand alone without justification. I want to create. I want to help. I want to explore. They don't need external validation because they emerge from internal fullness. Jung found that most people have never experienced pure soul desires because they've been unconsciously motivated by ego programming since childhood. Spiritual awakening strips away the ego programming, revealing the authentic desires that have been buried underneath. But accessing these authentic desires requires what Jung called conscious waiting, learning to sit in purposelessness without panicking, allowing something deeper to emerge naturally. After years of research on post-awakening motivation loss, Carl Jung developed a precise three-stage framework for transforming spiritual emptiness into authentic purpose. Jung called this the psychological resurrection process, a systematic approach to birthing new motivation from the ashes of old desires. Stage 1. Conscious dissolution. Jung discovered that most people resist the emptiness that follows awakening, which prolongs their suffering unnecessarily. The first stage involves consciously cooperating with the dissolution process instead of fighting it. Jung developed a technique called sacred grieving, actively mourning the death of your old motivations instead of trying to resurrect them. This involves writing letters to your former ambitions, acknowledging what they gave you, and consciously releasing them. I am grieving the part of me that wanted to be famous. One patient wrote, "This desire gave me energy for years, but now I see it was rooted in childhood needs for attention and validation. I honor what this motivation provided while releasing what no longer serves." Jung found that conscious grieving accelerates the dissolution process and prevents the psychological complications that arise when people try to artificially maintain dead motivations. Stage 2. Active imagination. Once you've consciously released old purposes, Jung's second stage involves using active imagination to dialogue with your emerging authentic self. This isn't visualization or positive thinking. It's a specific technique for communicating with unconscious parts of your psyche. Jung instructed patients to sit quietly and ask, "What wants to be born through me?" Then wait for images, words, or feelings to arise spontaneously. The key is receiving what emerges without editing or judging it. Maria, the patient Jung worked with, began receiving images of herself teaching children in nature. At first, she dismissed this as fantasy because she had no teaching experience, but Jung encouraged her to follow the impulse without needing to understand it rationally. Within months, Maria was volunteering at environmental education programs, feeling more alive than she had in years. The motivation wasn't driven by career goals or social expectations. It emerged from what Jung called soul recognition. Stage 3. Symbolic living. Jung's final stage involves organizing your life around symbols and synchronicities rather than goals and plans. This doesn't mean becoming impractical. It means allowing a deeper intelligence to guide your choices. Jung called this living symbolically, paying attention to what calls to you, what energizes you, what feels aligned. Even when it doesn't make logical sense, you follow fascination instead of obligation, curiosity instead of strategy. Jung found that people living symbolically often accomplished more than those driven by traditional motivation because they were working with the full force of their authentic nature instead of fighting against it. The key insight Jung discovered is that authentic motivation doesn't feel like motivation at all. It feels like following your natural inclinations, like water flowing downhill. There's effort involved, but it's sustainable effort because it aligns with your deepest nature. Jung warned that this process can't be rushed or forced. The psyche has its own timing for resurrection, and trying to accelerate it often creates spiritual bypassing, pretending to be motivated when you're actually still in the dissolution phase. But Jung promised that those who navigate this process consciously emerge with unshakable purpose that can't be destroyed by external circumstances because it emerges from the indestructible core of their being. Here's Carl Jung's most profound discovery about post-awakening motivation, the insight that will completely transform how you understand purpose, calling, and authentic living. Jung found that the emptiness following spiritual awakening isn't the absence of motivation. It's the presence of motivation so pure and authentic that your ego can't recognize it. Jung called this soul motivation, impulses that emerge from your deepest nature rather than your conditioned desires. But here's what makes this discovery revolutionary. Soul motivation feels completely different from ego motivation. Most people miss it because they're looking for the wrong signals. Ego motivation feels urgent, driven, anxious. It carries a sense of, I have to do this, or something bad will happen. It's fueled by fear, scarcity, or external pressure. You feel it in your head as mental pressure and in your body as tension. Soul motivation feels calm, magnetic, inevitable. It carries a sense of, I get to do this because it's what I am. It's fueled by love, abundance, or authentic expression. You feel it in your heart as warmth and in your body as aliveness. Jung worked with a patient named David who perfectly illustrated this distinction. Before his awakening, David was motivated to become a lawyer by anxiety about financial security and parental approval. After awakening, that motivation completely died, leaving him feeling directionless for months. But slowly, David began noticing a different kind of impulse. He felt drawn to spend time in nature, not for any specific purpose, but because it felt like coming home. He started taking long walks, and during these walks, ideas would emerge about environmental conservation. It doesn't feel like motivation, David told Jung. It feels like remembering something I always knew, but had forgotten. When I'm working on environmental projects, I'm not trying to achieve anything. I'm just expressing what I am. Jung realized that David had discovered what he called ontological motivation. Motivation that emerges from being rather than wanting. Instead of being driven by what he lacked, David was inspired by what he was. This led Jung to a startling conclusion. Most people never experience authentic motivation because they're too busy pursuing ego-driven goals to notice soul-driven impulses. The post-awakening emptiness isn't a crisis. It's an opportunity to finally hear the voice of your authentic self. But Jung discovered that soul motivation operates according to completely different principles than ego motivation. Soul motivation is seasonal. It comes in waves and cycles, rather than being constantly available. Jung found that trying to force soul motivation leads to spiritual exhaustion. Soul motivation is collaborative. It works with life circumstances rather than trying to control them. Instead of pushing against resistance, it finds the path of least resistance. Soul motivation is mysterious. You often don't understand why you're called to something until after you follow the calling. Jung encouraged patients to trust the impulse before understanding the purpose. Soul motivation is sustainable because it emerges from your authentic nature. It doesn't deplete your energy, it generates energy. People living from soul motivation often feel energized by their work rather than drained by it. Jung's breakthrough insight was that the transition from ego motivation to soul motivation requires what he called motivational fasting. A period where you consciously abstain from forcing any agenda while learning to sense subtler impulses. This is why the post-awakening emptiness is so crucial. It's your psyche's way of clearing space for authentic impulses to emerge. If you fill that space too quickly with new goals and plans, you miss the opportunity to discover what Jung called the life that wants to live through you. Jung found that people who learn to live from soul motivation often describe feeling like their life is living them rather than them living their life. They become conduits for something larger than their personal desires while remaining fully engaged with practical reality. The key is learning to trust impulses that feel good in your body, align with your values, and generate energy rather than depleting it, even when they don't make sense to your rational mind. After decades of research on post-awakening transformation, Carl Jung made a final discovery that revolutionized his understanding of human potential. When you learn to live from soul motivation, you don't just regain your drive, you access a form of purpose so powerful and sustainable that it transforms everything you touch. Jung called this incarnated purpose. When your authentic essence finds expression through your human life, this isn't about finding your passion or discovering your calling. It's about becoming a channel for something that wants to emerge through you into the world. Jung observed that people living from soul purpose share specific characteristics that distinguish them from those operating from ego motivation. They work from overflow, not depletion. Instead of pushing themselves to achieve goals, They allow their natural enthusiasm to carry them forward. Their work energizes them because it aligns with their deepest nature. They respond rather than initiate. Instead of forcing opportunities, they become highly sensitive to what life is offering them. They develop what Jung called synchronistic awareness, the ability to recognize meaningful coincidences as guidance. They serve something larger without losing themselves. Their work benefits others not through self-sacrifice, but through authentic expression. They've learned that serving their own soul purpose automatically serves the collective. Jung worked with a patient named Elena, who embodied this transformation perfectly. Before her awakening, Elena was a successful marketing executive driven by ambition and financial goals. After awakening, she lost all interest in corporate success and spent 2 years feeling completely unmotivated. But gradually, and began noticing impulses to create art, something she hadn't done since childhood. She started painting during weekends with no intention of showing or selling her work. The act of creation itself felt like breathing. Within a year, Elena's paintings began attracting attention. People said her art helped them process grief and trauma. Elena realized her sole purpose wasn't to be a professional artist. It was to create healing through beauty. "I'm not trying to build an art career," Elena told Jung. "I'm just following what wants to emerge through me. The impact happens naturally because I'm expressing something authentic." Jung discovered that this is how soul purpose operates. It serves the world through authentic self-expression rather than strategic action. When you're truly aligned with your soul's calling, your mere existence becomes a gift to others. But Jung warned against romanticizing this process. Living from soul purpose requires tremendous courage because it often leads you away from conventional success metrics. You might make less money, receive less recognition, or face criticism from people who don't understand your choices. Jung called this the sacrifice of the golden ego, releasing attachment to external validation in favor of internal alignment. It's not always easy, but Jung found it's always sustainable because it emerges from the inexhaustible source of your authentic nature. The ultimate goal isn't to find your purpose, but to become so aligned with your authentic self that purpose finds you. When this happens, Jung discovered, motivation becomes effortless because you're no longer swimming against the current of your own nature. You're not trying to motivate yourself to live authentically. You're allowing authentic living to motivate you. Here's Carl Jung's ultimate insight about post-awakening motivation. The emptiness you're experiencing isn't the absence of purpose. It's the presence of purpose so authentic that your ego can't recognize it. Your old motivations had to die because they were keeping you from discovering what Jung called the life that wants to live through you. The void you're in isn't empty. It's pregnant with possibilities that can only emerge when you stop trying to fill it with old patterns. Jung discovered that soul motivation doesn't feel like traditional motivation at all. It feels like following your natural inclinations, like water flowing downhill. It's sustainable because it comes from abundance, not scarcity. The awakening didn't kill your motivation, it killed your limitations. Your assignment is to practice what Jung called conscious waiting. Instead of trying to force new goals or resurrect old ambitions, spend time each day asking, what wants to emerge through me? Then listen without judgment to whatever arises. Remember, Jung discovered that authentic purpose can't be figured out. It can only be lived into. Trust that your soul knows what it's doing. Even when your mind doesn't understand the process, you're not broken for losing motivation after awakening. You're being prepared for motivation so authentic and powerful that it will transform not just your life, but everyone your life touches. Write in the comments, I trust the process. Let's build a community of people who understand that spiritual emptiness is often spiritual pregnancy. Something beautiful is being born. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about authentic living, check out my video on Carl Jung's warning, the final dirty trick narcissists use, where I reveal a terrifying truth about narcissistic manipulation that could save your psychological freedom. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.